are listening to TMI for the week of March 19th, 2018.
Today, Dave speaks to Dr. Chris Busby about depleted uranium weapons, waste storage, leaking plants, new reactors at Hinkley Point, past accidents, and nuclear test veterans in court.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Busby.
Yeah.
I just have to say off the top, pardon me for gushing. For people who follow nuclear, you're the king bee. I've seen you in lots of videos and seen some of your papers. So, pardon me if I'm a little starstruck.
Well, that's all right. A lot of people hate me, you know, so, I mean, I don't mind a bit of balance on the other side.
Sure. Well, that's a good place to start. I mean, the number one technique of people who are proponents of nuclear power is to use ad hominem logical fallacy.
Yes, well, I mean, as far as I can make out, this is not just a lot of people that hate me. It's actually some kind of operation. You know, I mean, I sort of imagine something like those operation rooms that they had during the war. You know, down in the cellars with these WAFs sort of pushing little battleships across maps. You know, that kind of thing. I think they've probably got a few of those pro-nuclear outfits that sit down and figure out what I'm doing and try to sort of you know, attack me over whatever it is. I mean, in fact, I know that's true because there's one outfit called Nuclear Power, Yes Please, where they've got a chap called well, he calls himself Lorenzo, but no, Lancelot. He calls himself Lancelot. That's right. Yeah, his Matthias Lantz, his name is. He's got a degree in physics, and just after about everything I do, he attacks. And then puts pictures of me out on the internet with funny clothes on and all the rest of it. It doesn't actually seem to do me a lot of harm, because, like Mark Twain said, you know, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not entirely true, because there is such a thing as bad publicity, and I have been brought down by that guy George Monbiot writing in the Guardian and saying all sorts of lies about what I do.
I'd like to ask you about him. But first, I'd like to point out that, you know, like Dr. Caldecott or just sort of anybody who sticks their foot out suddenly, and it's exactly what you say, they'll put up crazy, they'll take a video of yours and then pick you in a strange pose and then put a caption under it, turn you into a meme. This George Monbiot, how do you pronounce his last name?
Well, I think he calls it Monbiot.
Not Monbiot. He is famous for this. This is how he's sort of become famous, is by attacking other people who he doesn't agree with.
Yes. Well, I mean, you know, before that, I've known Monbiot for a very long time. I mean, he was involved in the Green Party and in the Green movement in the 90s as a sort of activist, somebody who lay down in front of diggers and climbed trees and opposed things. With non-violent direct action. And so when I was in the Green Party in those days, in the 90s, we decided that non-violent direct action was a legitimate way of, well, it always has been, a legitimate way of trying to get to, you know, your political ends.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the argument was, and still is, that the political system itself is stacked against anybody changing it. And so if you wanted to change something, what you did is you inhabited offices, or you lay down in front of cars, or you blocked the streets. There are lots of things that you can do. And I was involved in that. In fact, I gave a talk at the South Place Ethical Society, I think in about 1995, about how it was legitimate to do this sort of non-violent direct action. Anyway, Monbiot was involved at that time, and so I got to know him reasonably well then. And what I concluded fairly rapidly was that actually he wasn't what he pretended to be, that he was somebody who used to feed through information to the police and who used to divert these actions in directions, you know, in the wrong direction. And he was a sort of fifth columnist. And that was long before anything to do with nuclear. That was in the 90s. And then he got this position with the Guardian newspaper, where he used to talk about global warming mainly, but also a lot of quite legitimate and quite well written articles about the way of the world and how it should go, and, you know, various sort of green philosophy angles. and he also used to consult me on nuclear, right the way through till about 2011, when he suddenly jumped off that particular ship and decided to say that nuclear was the only possible solution to global warming. And of course, he had to take down Christopher Busby, who was like one of the main scientific opponents. I mean, there are lots of opponents for nuclear, but I'm sort of not unique, but fairly high, fairly at the top of the scientists who attack it on a kind of rational level. Who can actually go in there and argue with these people on the same level that they think, and can deal with the numbers. Deal with the mathematics and the statistics and so on. So I had to be brought down, and I was.
2011 seems the weirdest time you could possibly start becoming a proponent of nuclear.
Well, the thing is that it was a nightmare for the nuclear industry, you see. I mean, it was just digging itself out of the Chernobyl disaster and all of the problems associated with that. And of course they had a huge cover-up going over the real effects of Chernobyl accident. I mean, I was associated. I was friends with an awful lot of those Russian scientists or ex-Soviet scientists from Belarus and Ukraine, and also from the Russian Federation, Alexey, Yablokov, and people like that. And it was quite clear that they were covering all that stuff up, but they just dug themselves out of that. And then they had this Fukushima thing, you see. So they had to mobilize somebody quickly to try and cover that over, and that's what they did. So they brought Monbiot out of the box at that point, I think.
The Yablokov book that we probably have seen, it's Chernobyl: Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment. And this was a New York Academy of Science book. And the basic thing about that was that due to translation trouble and not taking the Russians seriously, this has and remains quite overlooked in terms of how to look at Chernobyl.
Well, Alexey and I wrote a book before that. We in 2006 we collaborated on a book which was a series of chapters written by different scientists from the ex-Soviet Union, and that was called Chernobyl 20 Years After. Huh. And then we updated that and we redid it in 2009. So that got around. We printed that and we sold quite a lot of those. And around about the same time as the second edition of this, Alexey brought out that one, the Academy of Sciences one, together with Jeanette Sherman. Or through Jeanette Sherman, who's also a friend of mine. So that's the one that everybody, that the nuclear industry attacks. And the agencies, they all attack it. They say it wasn't properly peer-reviewed and all this stuff. But the fact is, it was completely full of references to various scientific papers in Russian journals that were peer-reviewed. And in fact, in 2004, Alexey came to the conference that was held in St. Catherine's College, Oxford, as part of the Kerry. We got this committee going with Michael Meacher called the Committee Examining Radiation Risk from Internal Emitters, or Kerry. And there was an international conference that we held in St. Catherine's College, Oxford, in 2004. And we brought over Yablokov, and we brought over that woman Berlikova, Elena Berlikova, who was the head of the Russian Radiological Committee for the Russian Academy of Sciences. So, really big cheese. Mm-hmm. And they brought in all sorts of scientific papers that had been in Russian, but with the abstracts translated to show all these effects that had occurred after Chernobyl. But of course all that stuff was ignored. It was all covered up and ignored. So all of that, so that information has been out for a very long time. It's just that it's not, it's not considered, it's not accepted by the risk agencies.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I know you from is there's video of you debating with that former retired ICRP head.
Valentine, yes. Well, I was invited to Stockholm to talk to Valentine. I think Valentine actually was quite upset about the way in which his job had become one where he was kind of supporting the nuclear industry. I don't think he would have agreed to debate that with me otherwise. He really stuck his neck out. This was at the University of Stockholm, and it was arranged by Milkas, was just the anti-nuclear secretariat. Because what happens in Sweden is, as a result of human rights, the Swedish state actually funds an anti-nuclear organization, because otherwise it's not a level playing field. You have all the people with the money on one side and people with no money on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But they do give some money to the anti-nuclear groups in Sweden. So he set this up, and we made these two presentations. But at the end of the presentations, he was Jack Valentine sat down and was he was prepared to discuss it all with me. And then Ditta Rietema, who was my girlfriend, she videoed the whole thing, and we stuck it up on the internet. And you can see that Valentine says there quite clearly that it was wrong for the ICRP not to consider the real effects of the Chernobyl accident, not to actually address the papers that had been done, all the studies that had been done. They just ignored them. And if you look in the ICRP 2007 risk model, the updated risk model, they barely touch on Chernobyl. They say nothing at all about it. And yet the evidence from Chernobyl is that the health effects are screamingly wrong. Not the health effects, but the model for the health effects is screamingly wrong. It's just out by factors of thousands for internal radiation.
And in the dialogue or the mandate of the ICRP, doesn't it say to other regulators that it's not really used as it isn't recommended that it is used as the risk model?
Yes, they do say that. They do, but of course nobody listens. Everybody ignores it. I mean, as I said to Valentine, I said, "What's it for then?"
Yeah.
Because he did make that point, and I said, "Well, what's the point of it?" I mean, and he said, "Oh, it's just for sort of general regulatory purposes or some nonsense like that." And I said, "Well, what happens if there's and this was before Fukushima. I said, what happens if there's a big accident like Chernobyl, and governments want to know what the outcome is going to be in order to plan things and so on?" He said, "Well, it's not really meant for that."
Well, I've been to regulatory hearings here in Canada, and I've heard ICRP used as the international standard, and then the term IAEA best practices, which is usually a bit of a chuckle. But would you mind listing some of your books?
Well, I wrote the first book I wrote I wrote some really small ones that I printed myself, but the first real book I wrote was called Wings of Death, and that was published in 1995. I was funded by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. That's quite a good book. It has nearly everything in it, and it's still available if anybody wants to buy it. We've still got some boxes of those. We printed 3,000, I think, and most of them have gone, but we've still got some. Wings of Death, 1995. Then what happened then was I wrote about the cover-ups in a big book called Wolves of Water, which was published in 2006, and that was also funded by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and that contains information about Sellafield and about the Irish Sea, because the Irish Sea is contaminated with these radionuclides as a result of the reprocessing plant at Sellafield in Cumbria.
Mm-hmm.
And the effects of that on the coastal populations were something that I was asked to look at by the Irish government. So my group, between 1997 and 2000, we examined the cancer rates by distance from the sea, and we looked into all of that stuff. And all of that information at the time was supposed to be kept secure because it was going to go into court. But in about 2005, the Irish government decided they weren't going to pursue the court case. So at that point, I thought, well, okay, there's an awful lot of it. So I put it all in that book called Wolves of Water. That's also quite an interesting book. But before that, I was the editor of the first report of the European Committee on Radiation Risk, so that's called ECRR 2003. So that's, if you like, the opposite report to the ICRP report. So that tells you how to calculate how many cancers and dead babies you're going to get from any internal radiation exposure. So that's ECRR 2003. And then in 2006 we published Chernobyl 20 years after. That was Yablokov and me. And then we did the second edition of that in 2009. And then in 2010, we published the second edition of the ECRR risk model. That's called ECRR 2010, and there's another one coming out this year, so there's going to be an ECRR 2018. So each one of those brings in more evidence, because of course evidence is coming in all the time that they're wrong. Like every year there are more papers coming out showing that the risk model that is operating at the moment is just totally mad, completely wrong, and that people are dying all over the place. So where have I got to? 2010. In 2012, we published a book called Fukushima: What to Expect. That was the proceedings of a conference that we held in Greece in 2010, I think. No, it can't have been. Yes. No, it must have been 2011. Anyway, it's called Fukushima: What to Expect. So where are we now? So there haven't been any books since then, except I wrote a book about what is life in 2012, because that's another thing that I do is to figure out how life works. So I published a paper this last year about the origin of life on Earth and how it occurred. So
wow.
That's been published.
All of it sounds fascinating. So this pursuit of nuclear as an issue has taken you all over the world.
Oh yes, sure. I've spoken in most countries, and I've crawled about through battlefields in the Balkans looking for depleted uranium, and I've crawled about in Iraq, in southern Iraq, and on the border with Kuwait, looking for depleted uranium. Yeah, sure. No, I've been all over the place. Yeah, I've just come back from St. Louis, Missouri, actually, where I was looking at radioactivity from a thing called the West Lake landfill,
right?
Where Malincrot left a load of radioactivity there, still there.
And there's an underground garbage fire that's...
Yes, that's the one. That's right. Yes. So there's various court cases going forward there. I'm on board as an expert witness. We win all these cases, by and large. What happens is that I go in with all of this evidence that you know about, the sort of stuff that I've written in the books and the research that I've done, and usually and they nearly always settle.
Interesting.
So nobody gets to know that we've won, you see, because one of the points about settling is that they give you a load of money, or they give the litigants a load of money, the plaintiffs, and of course the lawyers also get a load of money, but nobody gets to know that you've won the case, because otherwise it would be a precedent, you see. If they actually ever get in, if it ever gets in front of a jury and the case is won, then what happens then? That's a precedent, and they all go down like dominoes, and they know that, so they're not going to ever let me get to win a case. And
there are usually non-disclosures attached to the payments?
Yes, of course, yes.
Wow. That's a tough choice between getting the victims their money and not settling.
Well, the point about the point about the lawyers is what they want to do is get the money, you see, and they want to get the victims the money, and they want to get the money.
Right.
So what they do is they go in. It's a sort of gunfight, really. So you go in there with your lawyers, and then you have a deposition or several depositions, where I sit down and I get attacked by the defense lawyers. It's a bit like an interrogation. They shine the lights on you and hammer away at you. But I'm quite good at that. So once that's done, then they try to get me thrown out. So they say, "Oh, this chap's not a real scientist. He's just a banjo player from the boondocks." But that's increasingly difficult for them to do. They've never actually succeeded in doing that. And as it goes on, and I get more and more papers published and do more and more things, they find it harder and harder to do it. So I don't think they're going to succeed in that in the future.
Have you been involved much in Canada?
Well, a little bit, yes. I was asked to do something about uranium mining. Oh. So I was involved in an argument about about developing a big open cast uranium mine at one point, and so I wrote a lot of stuff about that. And then I was taken on board as an expert witness by some Canadian parliamentarian, Alex at Macento or something like that. I can't remember, that sort of thing.
Was it focused
I gave evidence on that.
Was that in Saskatchewan?
Yes, I believe it was, yes.
It's odd, it's interesting here that Quebec, which actually had 2 nuclear power plants, and these Quebec people were smart enough to close them down, which I don't think ever happens in the history of nuclear, because usually there's a lock-in effect. Once you've got them, you can't get rid of them, but they are smart enough to close them down, and that province, I think it's still in place today, has a ban on uranium mining in Quebec. So there's one province that seems to have got it right. But
well, I've been all over the place about trying to stop uranium mining. Uranium mining is a serious problem. I mean, in fact, uranium is my favorite villain of the piece at the moment.
Yeah.
I've just written a book about it. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about it. There is a book that was published last year. No, this year. Well, 2017 on uranium. So I published a book on uranium and its health effects.
And I
studied uranium health effects in the University of Ulster. I had a PhD student there who we were looking at photoelectron emission from uranium particles.
Interesting.
And that seems to be, well, in my opinion, that's the reason why uranium is so very dangerous, because it binds to DNA, and also that it has this very high atomic number, which means that it amplifies natural background radiation.
And when the phrasing that I've heard was it's the toxicity of uranium, which is
yes. Well, I've developed a new sort of concept on that. It's called radiochemical genotoxicity. So, in other words, uranium is always classified as a radiological genotoxin. So, in other words, they say, well, what's the dose? So, if you work out and because it's such a low specific activity, because it has such a long half-life, the idea is that it's hardly radioactive at all. But in fact, what it does is it binds to DNA, you see, and because it has a very high atomic number, it also blocks the passage of gamma radiation. So if you're for instance, if you're a radiologist, going back in time, you wear a lead apron, and the reason you wear a lead apron is it blocks the X-rays, and the reason it blocks the X-rays is because lead has got a very high atomic number. But an even higher atomic number is uranium. See? So if you wore a uranium apron, it would block the X-rays even more. But the energy from those X-rays, or from gamma rays, or anything else that hits it in the form of photon radiation, is converted into these photoelectrons, which are exactly like beta particles. So if you imagine that this stuff is inside you, what happens is that when you shine an X-ray on somebody, and the X-rays mostly go through, and you then see the image with the bone and everything. But if you had a piece of uranium there, it would just be black, because it would stop all the X-rays. None of them would get through. Now, if you imagine that's inside you, and if you imagine also it's stuck on the DNA, because that's its chemical affinity, what you're doing there is you're putting something on the DNA which just blocks all the radiation that's coming in and feeds it into the DNA, you see. So that's why it's so dangerous.
Fascinating. There's this fetish of science surrounding nuclear and operating a nuclear plant and the mathematical calculations to calculate the rate of the reaction, all this. But there's very few epidemiological studies. It seems.
That's right. That's right. There are none. In fact, in America, there was a plan to do a load of epidemiological studies around a selected number of nuclear sites. I think there were 12 nuclear sites.
Yeah, we were all waiting for that. That was very exciting that they had announced they were going to do that.
Yeah. But then eventually they realized that if they did it, that they would find something, so they knocked it on the head.
So if it's really safe, you would expect there would be lots of epidemiological studies.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, actually, I think I probably am partly responsible for that, because round about the time that they were just about to go ahead with it, because it got batted backwards and forwards between the NRC and the Department of Energy, the DOE, who were the other people? The National Academy of Sciences, the NAS, okay, and so. It was sort of like a poison chalice, so it was taken by the NAS, who had to sort of say, well, this is how it should be done, and they sent it back to the NRC to do it, and the NRC sent it back to them, and it went backwards and forwards, and eventually they said, well, no, we're not going to do it. But round about that time, I had just published three papers in the peer-review literature showing that there was a statistically significant excess of breast cancer close to 3 nuclear power stations in England. So that one of them was Bradwell in Essex, one of them was Hinkley Point in Somerset, which I'm working on at the moment, actually, Hinkley Point in Somerset. We've just been down to the Welsh Assembly to talk about that yesterday with Richard. And the other one is Trawsfynydd, which is a nuclear site in Wales, which was kind of near where I used to live. So I've studied that for a long time too. And we found high levels of cancer around all three of these. And in one of them, we looked at infant mortality, and we found an excess risk of infant mortality too. And that all went into the peer-reviewed literature. And then shortly after that, I did one in America. I did, what was that one in California, Diablo Canyon. Mm-hmm. So I looked at infant mortality there, because you can't get hold of cancer data; they won't give it to you. So, but you can get hold of infant mortality data. So we looked at early infant mortality there, and we found an effect. And round about that time, that's when they knocked it on the head, and they said, "Oh, we're not going to do these studies." Because, I mean, obviously they figured out that if they did do the studies, they would find something, and then what? See, so they pulled out. I mean, I wrote an article about that in the Ecologist, I think.
There's the German kick. Is there
there's that one too. Yeah. Well, if you're looking at childhood leukemia, there's a whole load of them.
Okay.
I mean,
is there a French
study
one?
with the childhood leukemia? Then there was a meta study in France too by a woman, by Laurier.
Okay. Meanwhile, when things go wrong, we are never told about it, and that affects our ability to mitigate, keep Johnny in out of the rain if there's something going on. And so, what of this? Is it the ruthenium-106 that's mysteriously floating around Europe? What do you make of that?
Oh well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we've had that. We've had a number of scares in Europe. There was another one. I can't remember, something else, that there was an increase in radioactivity that came from plant in Hungary. The ruthenium-106. Well, the Russians say that it's some satellite that's burnt up. I don't know is the answer. I can't. I mean, there's not. Like you say, there's not enough information. It's just somebody picks it up somewhere and says, "Hey, wow, here's some ruthenium-106." Ruthenium-106 is not a big deal, incidentally. It's not one of the bad ones. It's not something that I would consider to be. I mean, obviously, it's not. If you're living quite close to wherever the leak was, you'd get a bit of a dose.
Normally, though, where there's smoke, there's fire. If there's one fission product coming out, isn't the other host of its friends?
Well, you would think so, but they actually said not. I mean, a number of people have actually have in fact. This is why it's a bit puzzling, the ruthenium-106, because if it was a fission release from a nuclear reactor, you certainly see. You'd see the xenons and you'd see the cesiums, and there would be a lot more radionuclides around, and somebody would have picked that up, because there are lots and lots of people now who've got scintillation counters and can do fairly crude gamma spectroscopy. I mean, most universities have got a gamma spectrometer now, so people would have blown the whistle on that, I think, if there had been more isotopes than ruthenium. So it suggests to me that it's either somewhere where they use ruthenium as some kind of thermonuclear source, so just heat, or else it's a radioisotope production facility where they make ruthenium-106 for some medical purpose or something.
They were pointing at that Mayak. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
Yes, Mayak, yes.
And that is the site of a giant problem back in the 50s. Isn't that one of the underrated nuclear accidents?
Yeah, no, they've had some big accidents in Russia or in the ex-Soviet Union. They had the enormous one at Chelyabinsk. That's the 1957 one that was written about by Medvedev. And in fact, that area is still contaminated. They do a lot of experiments there on the basis of trying to see the effects of internal radionuclides on animals and plants and so forth. So there's a lot of work done on that Chelyabinsk accident. I think 1957 it was.
And that's the same site as the Mayak?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Mayak is a radio. It's a bit like Sellafield, It's where they do all the radiation research. So it's all contaminated, all over, really badly contaminated. And they've been they do a lot of studies there. Well, there've been a number of retrospective studies there to show that these things aren't actually dangerous. So they go along there and they choose a load of people and they say, they do what's called retrospective dosimetry, so they figure out how much dose they got of various nuclides, the main one being plutonium. And then they say, oh, well, we only got this number of cancers, therefore, it's not such a big deal. But, of course, most of the people are dead. That's the problem with all of these retrospective studies. It's like the retrospective studies that they did for radium, which I've studied quite closely, that one. In America, they, in order to try and figure out the health effects of internal radionuclides, they looked at all the radium dial painters and the people who worked with radium. And they assembled an enormous study group. And they even went around digging up their bodies and measuring the radium inside the bones in order to get an idea of the doses. And then they looked at the death certificates in order to see how many cancers there were. So then they related the amount of dose that they got to the amount of cancers that they got, and that roughly fitted in with their idea of how it all works. But the problem is, like, most of these people had disappeared. So they only had a selection of people, and an awful lot of the dial painters had died of non-cancer illnesses quite early on, quite young. And so, of course, if you die of a non-cancer illness, you don't die of cancer. So it was a group of people that were survivors, a bit like the Hiroshima cohort, who were assembled in 1952, 7 years after the bomb. So these retrospective methods, the same with MIAC too, the retrospective methods for determining the health effects of internal radionuclides are all absurd.
What got you interested in nuclear?
Well, originally I was interested in it as a sort of abstract idea, because I'm interested in everything. I'm not just interested in radiation. But what happened was that there was an article in the newspaper around about the time of, just after Chernobyl, and I lived in Wales at the time of Chernobyl, so all this radioactive rain came down, and I kept everybody in, and we tried to avoid it. I mean, actually, I was out fishing at the time, so I got quite soaked. But anyway, I sort of got interested in the idea, and then shortly after that, there was a report from Sellafield that said that all the seagulls had died, had disappeared. And then somebody wrote in and said that it was nothing to do with radioactivity. And I thought, this seems a bit silly, So I started to look into it and try to figure out how they could say such a thing. And then just one thing led to another. And very early on, I figured out that their risk model didn't allow for the possibility of 2 hits in a cell within the repair cycle of the cell, which is about 12 hours. And so I developed an idea called the second event theory, which actually I think is correct, and I think I still stand by that too, although everybody fights about it. I think if you hit a cell lots of times in a short space of time, it's not the same as hitting a cell once in a year. So natural background radiation, for example, each cell in the body gets, on average, 1 hit in a year, which can be repaired mostly, nearly always. But if you've got something that's banging away at a cell, at a high rate in a short space of time, then that's obviously not the same thing. And yet that's the same dose, you see. The problem is that their idea of how to calculate dose is wrong, because it's a sort of averaging idea. So I figured that out in about 1989. I couldn't believe that they did this. I just couldn't believe it. And so I wrote to Ed Radford, who's dead now. I mean, I know all those people, I know Ed Radford, Goffman, Rosalie Bertel, Alice Stewart. I know all of them. Anyway, they're all dead now. There's only me left. I'm the last of the Mohicans.
One of the reasons why I asked you about what got you interested in nuclear was I keep expecting that there was already a concern about nuclear because of this whole, and I love how whenever there's a problem, you just rename the site. So if it's AEC, it becomes NRC. If it's Windscale, it becomes Sellafield. But the Sellafield, the Windscale disaster, that's a terrifying setup. Was it, and you'll correct me, but it was like 13 tons of uranium and graphite on fire for days with no containment.
Oh, yes. And it killed a lot of people too, I can tell you. If you read my book, Wolves of Water, we actually followed that up. I wrote to the Isle of there's this island in just about 50 miles between Sellafield and Ireland, right in the middle. called the Isle of Man.
Yeah.
And I wrote to the government there, and I asked for all their mortality statistics, and they sent them to me. So I got all these mortality statistics books, which we looked at. And after the Windscale fire, what happened is that the mortality just shot straight up. So but the point about radiation doesn't just cause cancer.
Yeah.
It kills you. I mean, so what happens is that if you get a big packet of radiation like that, what happened is that the Windscale fire, the wind was blowing it out to sea. And so all the nasty radionuclides all went out to sea, and the problem was that there was a cold front coming from Ireland across the Irish Sea towards England from the to moving eastwards, and the radiation hit the cold front round about the time that it was crossing the Isle of Man and then going down to County Louth in Ireland, and it rained heavily over the Isle of Man, and all that stuff came down on the Isle of Man. That's why they all died. Now, the problem is, you see, if you go along there afterwards and you do retrospective analysis of cancer, you might well find that the cancer rates in the Isle of Man are lower than they should be. But then, of course, that's because everybody died.
And the areas around Windscale, is it true to this day they're not allowed to do dairy farming?
No, that's not so. No, there's business as usual. There are some controls still in place about upland farming with sheep, because there are pockets of radiocesium all over the place, and they measure the concentrations of radio. I mean, the English are very good at measuring things, so they measure the concentrations of radionuclides in milk and in produce and potatoes and vegetables and fish and shellfish and everything. So every year there's a big fat book that gives all these concentrations. But what they don't do is they don't look at the particles. So I mean, this is news. In fact, I can tell you, you'll be the first person to know that I got some sediment from the people who are the anti-nuclear group up there called CORE, and they sent me some sediment about 3 or 4 months ago. Because what happened was that Arnie Gunderson went over there and he picked up some sediment there and he took it back to America and he gave some of it to Marco Kaltofen, and Marco looked at some of the particles in it and he said, "Hey, these are radioactive particles." And so there was a bit of a hoo-ha about that, but I wasn't quite sure, so I wanted to actually use this. It's like a sort of photographic film method of looking to see whether these particles are radioactive or not. So she sent me. She took some more samples and split them and sent some to Marco and the other half to me, and I've been looking at those. And what I've found is that they are all riddled with radioactive particles. So in fact, you can take 0.1 of a gram of material, like 1/10 of a gram of material, and you can find 10 radioactive particles in it. I mean, seriously hot particles that are like giving off alpha. The one I can tell you, one that we presented in the Welsh Assembly yesterday or the day before. It had been sitting in front of this photographic film for about 40 hours, and it had 10. I think it had 10 hot particles in, or 8 or something like that. You could see them. You could see the rays coming off them. It's called an alpha star. Now, the point is that those things just didn't exist throughout the whole of evolution. But now they're everywhere. They're in the mud on the coast, and they're flying about in the air. People can inhale them. They get into the air filters in cars. And they're the main problem in Fukushima, incidentally, too. So you have all these hot particles just floating about in the air, and they get into people's lungs, and then they get into the lymphatic system. They can go anywhere. And they can irradiate local tissue with a huge amount of radiation.
And
then you get the cancers, of course.
For listeners, just as an example, I mean, they find little microparticles of plastic in the Arctic, or there's that huge barge of garbage out in the Pacific. The point is that, it's not that any huge amount was unloaded everywhere. It's that this builds up over time and it spreads over the entire Earth, and now we can start measuring this stuff.
We've had exactly. We've had 50 years of it since more than that, since the fission, and then since the weapons testing. I mean, it's the weapons testing is the big one. That showered this stuff down all over the place. And what we're seeing now is the effects in the children who were born in 1959 to 63. Cancer rates are going through the roof in those people, and in their children too. So there was recently a paper where some epidemiologists in America, I forget, I think it was in one of these American Journal of Epidemiology or something like that, where they'd figured out suddenly, they said there was a sharp increase in colon cancer in young people. So people aged 25 to 35 are now presenting with colon cancer. This is unheard of. Unheard of. Because colon cancer is one of the most studied cancers, and it's the one that was studied originally in the 50s, and Armitage and Doll, a very famous theory which has now been updated, but basically it's the correct theory, is that you need to have 4 or 5 genetic damage loci in the DNA before you get the cancer. And then when you get the 5th one, off you go. So because of they did that analysis on the basis of the rate of cancer with aging. So as you get older, the cancer rate goes up. Now, colon cancer is in those days was more or less unheard of in people under the age of 50. But now they're getting and that's because it took up to the age of 50 to get these 5 genetic damages. You see, because you get one. If we call them A, B, C, D, you get A, and then the cells that contain A then replicate. And then you get 2 cells with A, then you get 4 cells with A, then you get 8 cells, and then you get B. You see, so now you've got A, B. So then you get 2 cells with A, B, and then 4, and so on. So that was the mathematical theory behind this, and it works. So the point is that under that system, you can't get cancer until you've got all 5, A, B, C, D, E, right? But you don't get those until you're about 55, 60. Then the probability goes up that you can get those. But now they're getting them much earlier. They're getting at the age of 25 and 35, which means that the germ cells, that means that the cells in their body, in their colons to begin with, have already got A, B, and C because they inherited them from their parents, do you see? And the parents got them because they were born at the time of the weapons fallout.
Wow.
So basically what they've done, these nuclear people, and they're all physicists too, so they don't understand this biology. They don't, they don't care about it. I mean, there's one bloke called, what was he called? The British nuclear fuels guy called Wakeford. He's on the ICRP now, and he's on the International Atomic Energy, and he's the guy who went to Fukushima to tell them they were all okay. I once talked to Wakeford, and I said, what about biology? He said, I don't know any biology. I said, well, shouldn't you? He said, no, I don't need to know about biology. I'm a physicist. And so that's the problem, you see, is they don't understand. They do it all as if it's some kind of bag of water, and they're calculating the energy distribution in a bag of water using mathematics.
In America and Canada, as soon as you accuse a policeman, all of the policemen are expected to stick together and get their stories straight and protect their own. And I wonder if that's a big part of this. Wouldn't you be drummed out of the scientific community if you broke away from what the standard line is?
Yes, of course, that is. You would certainly be drummed out of the nuclear science community,
right.
But that is what they all are. I mean, they are mostly physicists. You see, they are. I mean, I tell you what I think about all this. I think that it's a sort of rational versus emotional. It's a kind of like specific versus holistic split. Yeah, they don't seem to. I mean, whenever you argue with these people, they always drop back into mathematics. Whereas people, people's view of the world is not a mathematical view of the world. Mathematics is very useful for answering specific questions if you know that the maths works. But you can't apply it to complicated systems like living systems because they're far too sophisticated and complicated. So you have to come at that from a different angle. But the problem is the people who developed all these bombs, they were all physicists. So when it came to trying to figure out what these bombs did, what the radionuclides did, they did it all through physics. And a lot of them actually figured out that this was wrong, and they jumped ship. So you do have some heroes in all of this. You have Goffman, very famous guy, and he's dead now. And you have Ed Radford, who also he was the head of the Biological Effects Committee of the National Academy of Sciences. They kicked him out. And then Carl Z. Morgan, who actually started all this health physics right back at the beginning during the Manhattan Project. He also came out and he said, look, this is all a load of nonsense. We've got to go back and rethink it all. He wrote a book about it in the 90s called The Angry Genie, So you can buy that book, and in there, Carl Morgan says that the risk model is just wrong. But of course, as soon as they say that, they just get kicked out. They just lose their jobs. And I mean, Radford had to leave America and had to come and live in England.
It reminds me of examples around the turn of the last century where when a doctor would make a new discovery or develop a new theory, he'd have to present it to his peers, and then they, because it would break with tradition, would punish or
that's
discredit.
Certainly true. I mean, this whole thing about changing your view about how things work in science has been written about at some length. I mean, the classic book is by Thomas Kuhn, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was written in 1961, I think. And that more or less covers the whole thing. So but the problem is with Kuhn is he was only talking about changes in scientific understanding and how difficult they were to bring about, like Newton and Einstein, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem here is it's not as simple as that, because here you have enormous powers behind it all. You have all the military and their desire to have all these wonderful weapons, including depleted uranium, and you have the people who have the nuclear energy and all the money that they make and all the companies who work for them, and then you have the uranium economy. You have everybody who's invested money in uranium.
Mm-hmm.
British royal family, according to Ernest Sternglass, told me they had $8 billion invested in uranium shares. So, this is an area where it's not just about scientific thinking and changing a paradigm, which is in itself difficult enough, but it's an area in which, in order to change that paradigm, you've got to fight all these people, and they have the control of the media. So, and they can hire whole teams of people to attack people like Busby, and make out he's some kind of charlatan.
An interesting example here in Ontario is, so we have 20 plus nuclear reactors just in this one little province. And oddly enough, there's only one other nuclear reactor in another province. So they're all clustered here in nuclear, like a big nuclear experiment. And if you go take a poll even and ask the average Ontarian how many nuclear reactors in Ontario, they'll say 2 or 3. So, and this is, a program that's been going on since the late 60s. How can we all be so oblivious when it comes to nuclear? And it turns out that the nuclear industry advertises in our news media and newspapers, and etc. So how long are we going to have to wait till we hear the bad news about nuclear in Ontario in the news? And
I really don't know the answer to that. It's an uphill struggle, I'm afraid. But I mean, we do win occasionally. I mean, the big battle that we won recently. I mean, I don't know how long this is going to go on. But certainly it was won last month, and it is the decision by the Swedish Environmental Court to refuse the development of the high-level nuclear waste repository. Now those people, the waste repository people in Sweden, are like the jewel in the crown of the nuclear industry worldwide in terms of how to get rid of the high-level nuclear waste.
Right.
Nobody's ever figured that one out. And they thought that the Swedes had figured it out. They had this plan for putting it into copper canisters,
right?
Drilling a hole down,
I read your paper on that.
Stuff.
Now that's Forsmark.
They lost it.
That's Forsmark, Sweden, and I'll
yes.
put a link to your paper on that. That one I totally read a couple times. And that's them putting the waste into sealed copper canisters and then burying them. And not monitoring the ventilation or the condition of.
Just like put it down there and then pop a load of cement on top of it and sort of walk away.
And so your paper and video pointed out that these things are likely to explode in the next 300 years.
Yes, that was one of the things I said. But I actually gave them. I went there in September. They asked me to go and make a presentation to the court. These are 8 judges. So I went and they brought in an interpreter so that I said something in English and he said it in Swedish, and I was there for a week talking about this stuff. I put my talk up on YouTube, in fact, because Dissa taped it. And at the end of it all, they came to their decision in January, and they said we're not going to permit. Our advice to the Swedish government is they mustn't go ahead with this.
Wow.
So that was a hell of a blow for the nuclear industry, I can tell you.
Well, it's part of, whenever they pretend to have some kind of solution to nuclear waste, it just enables the production of more nuclear waste, essentially.
Well, what I say is that if you can get me, and I say this to the lawyers too, if I get in front of a jury, I mean, whenever I've been in front of a jury, I can always win. I can always persuade them, because what I say is true, and so manifestly true, and the evidence is all there. There's no argument about it. So that's the problem. The problem is we don't get in front of a jury. The problem is we get in front of the newspaper or a judge or somebody that's biased, and they can more or less say what they like. I mean, and in America they do. You know, the American media is just completely biased in favor of nuclear, and also I think in England too.
Here we have this plan to bury our low-level nuclear waste beside Lake Huron at what we call an OPG DGR. And there were a bunch of hearings, which is something I want to ask you about. But in the UK, it's the Lakes District. So I say, what is this about burying nuclear waste next to lakes? Like, do they hate the outdoors? Like, what is the deal? And how is that project coming along?
So far, nobody's made any decisions. At the moment, what they're doing is they're trying to find somewhere to bury the nuclear waste in England. So they're going around bribing local communities. Yeah. But nobody. I mean, in fact, the communities near Sellafield have refused.
Interesting.
So they've got to go and look somewhere else now.
I love what you said at bribing the officials. So the OPG-DGR, the Deep Geological Repository, for number one, they decided as mandate for this project that they wouldn't study other locations, one, and two, they hired the most expensive scientists in Canada to work on just this one location, creating a plan. And for 10 years now, they've been paying local councils, town councils, huge amounts of money each year. But it's funny that in the contract for those payments, it's up until the town council stops supporting the idea. So they're payments for complicity.
Well, I mean, there's one point I would I suppose I would make here, and that is that when you've got to do something with high-level nuclear waste, you've got to do something with low-level nuclear waste. So the question is, what do you do with it? Well, I mean, what I say is you leave it where it is, and you surround it with a barbed wire fence, put up a notice, and leave it there forever. But the other thing you could do with it is you say, well, we're going to put it all in one place near this community, but we're going to accept that people in this community are going to die of cancer. And we can say, look, since this is like, a dangerous place to be, living next to this stuff, we're going to give you a whole load of money. So, we're kind of like going to pay you to die of cancer. I mean, is that moral? I mean, it's kind of a version of what goes on in the world anyway, really.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
I want to ask about differences between Canada and the UK. So I'm interested in nuclear liability law. And the basic idea is that if you're a nuclear corporation, you just simply will not do business in a country until they've signed the Standard Form Nuclear Liability Act. And largely one of the things is obviously there's a cap on the liability of the owner or operator, a one-time cap, and then all the vendors are exempt, essentially, from liability. Is it the same model in the UK when it comes to nuclear liability after an accident?
There is a cap on the liability, yes. I'm not an expert on that, so I can't really comment. That's not my area is the health effects of low-level radiation. I don't even like talking too much about the different types of nuclear power station and how they operate and how dangerous they are and all that engineering end of things. It's just too much to do. I don't want to sort of put myself out as an expert on everything, but I was going to restrict myself to the way in which the releases from all of this radioactive pollution causes.
Well, it's an interesting point because in sort of fighting nuclear power, there are different disciplines that come to bear. there are the economics of it. There's the health of it. There's the basic, how it works, the physics of it. There's the morality of it. There's the geopolitics of it.
I can do that. I can do the morality and all that. But I don't. I don't like to talk about the engineering and the.
No, my point was that we need people who are specifically stick to their wheelhouse, and that it becomes a spectrum of people who bring different expertise to different areas. And so it's perfectly admirable for you to stick to the science, because actually that's the one, I think, area that we're all lacking. We're all showing up.
I think the health effects is the main thing. I mean, I'm always arguing with these people who go on and on about the economics of it. I mean, who cares about the economics of it? They can always change play at the goalposts as far as the economics is concerned. You can say, oh, well, what's going to happen when the coal runs out? What's going to happen, in Finland when the trees are all cut down? How do we stay warm? And those are all quite valid questions, actually. But, I mean, all I say about it is that it's a political decision which should be made on some kind of real democratic level. And democracy doesn't work if you don't have the facts. So if you don't know how many people are going to die, if you have to believe all this pie-in-the-sky nonsense about like it's 1 in a million years or the health effects are just virtually non-existent and so on, then people are not being given the correct information in order to make the decision. Obviously, if you say, well, look, if you've got this nuclear power station here, it's going to triple the rate of cancer, then they can say, well, all right, well, but if we don't have it here, we're all going to freeze to death. Then they can make a reasonable decision. So my job is to come along and say, look, this is the risk model, this is how it works, and this is what's going to happen to you if you keep on like this. And actually, it's quite a major problem, because it's going to result in a sort of inputting genetic damage not only to you but to the entire environment. So all the animals and the birds and the fish and the sand eels and all of these creatures are all going to reduce their ability to survive. And so you have to factor that into your argument when you're talking about how much energy you need. And then that feeds through to the whole concept of why we need this blooming energy anyway, The energy mostly goes to fund a crazy system of economics which produces too much and then tries to sell the too much to each other using even more money in the advertising of it all, when actually what people want is not all these things, but actually just to be happy.
Yeah.
That's my position really on it. My position is that the health effects are key to any sort of moral perspective or political perspective relating to the development of nuclear and weaponry, and the whole uranium fuel cycle.
For people who want to fight this, are public hearings a way to go? And what are they like? What are public? That's another sort of difference between Canada and the UK.
Well, yes. Well, they are a way to go, I think. They are a way to go, but it's a question of where you go with them, So, for instance, if there are no laws, if they don't have to do anything, so if you have a public hearing and somebody gets up and says, hey, wow, and somebody else gets up and says, gosh, and so on, and it all goes on, and then that's an end to it, then that doesn't really help anybody, does it? I mean, what you have to have is something rather like what they had in Sweden with the Swedish Environmental Court, where you had 8 judges, and they sit down and they take evidence, and then they sit and they think, well, is this right, or is it wrong, or is it, sufficiently worrying for us to invoke the precautionary principle? Those sorts of things. That should happen, and it did happen in Sweden, but it doesn't happen anywhere else.
And that's because of the structure of how they conduct those decisions, because we don't have anything like that here, I can say. I mean, our CNSC, the Nuclear Regulatory Body, is essentially, it's a panel of heavily pro-nuclear people pretending to ask tough questions.
That's right, yeah.
And
well, I mean, the interesting thing about Sweden is that it was set up by the Danish king, all of that stuff, and the Danish king didn't really trust his ministers. This was in the 6th, 17th century. And so he set up a system where there was a ministry to look at the other ministries. And that's sort of the way they think. It's a kind of quis custodia ipsos custodes thing, like who will guard the guardians. Because otherwise you can get groupthink. You can get all these people who all say, oh, what do you think, George? Oh, yes, definitely. And so on, and it just goes round in a circle. And if anyone comes along and says, look, I'm sorry, but the evidence is that this is wrong, they say, oh, no, I don't think. What do you think, George? No, I don't think. And it goes on like that. And they don't actually look at the facts at all.
Well, if we were really democracies, we would have referendums and we would have public inquiries, at least that provide public input.
Well, I'll tell you one thing at the moment. In Europe, there was in 1996, there was a move to have a uniform risk model introduced, or legal structure, called the Basic Safety Standards Directive, the Euratom Basic Safety Standards Directive. And right at the beginning, I was asked to go along with Alice Stewart and Rosalie Bertel and Alexey Yablokov and Inga Schmitz-Feuerhacher, all the Mohicans, had to go along there and talk about what they thought about this risk model. And we went along there, and this bloke Valentine came along as well from the ICRP. And we said that they should put some kind of clause in there that if there was new evidence that emerged that the risk model was wrong, it all had to be rethought. Okay. So in fact, the Parliament did do that. They put in a clause. It was Article 6, Clause 2, and it said if new and important evidence emerges that the basis for this radiation legislation is wrong, i.e. the ICRP risk model, then the whole thing has to be redone. So that's still there, So in 2016. Inga Schmitz-Feuerhacher and I and Sebastian, we wrote a paper which was published in a Korean journal, which is quite a posh journal, Toxicology Journal, in which we reviewed all of the evidence for the increase in congenital malformations in about 20 different countries following the Chernobyl accident. So countries that were, long away, Croatia and Greece and Turkey, Italy, France, and so on. There was a sharp increase in congenital malformations following Chernobyl, and the doses were absolutely tiny, less than natural background, you see, according to the ICRP. So this is new and important evidence. How can it not be? Like hundreds of thousands of children are dead as a result of this, so it's got to be new and important evidence. So we tried to invoke this law, and we were just ignored. We were just nobody would do anything. They all refused to do anything. So it's very hard to get, it's like this monolithic structure that it's impossible to penetrate with the truth. You go along there and say, look, here's black, and they say, no, it's white. What do you think, George? Yes, I think it looks like white to me, and that's it. So it's sort of like impossible to get anything done.
And, it's explainable because that movement of pro-nuclear is backed up by about $1 trillion of buildings and infrastructure, and the other side, there's no money for the bad news side of it.
That's right. We, as far as I'm concerned, after Monbiot wrote that thing in the Guardian, I never got any money from any of the people that funded me before. The Rowntrees sheared off, the Belden Buckham sheared off, all of the people who normally fund the Greenies, and funded me up until that date, just completely stopped. They completely stopped, and the Green Party, the pusillanimous Green Party, distanced themselves from me because they believed what Monbiot said about me selling all these pills to the Japanese, which just wasn't even true.
Yeah, that was a good
one. And I tried to get the Press Complaints Committee to force the Guardian to allow me to respond, and the Press Complaints Committee said, you've got to let Busby respond, and the Guardian said no. So that was that.
But and again, it's probably silly to pursue this, but let's say you were selling things that stopped calcium uptake or potassium iodide or whatever. How would that be a bad thing? In this case, you would have been helping out.
It's a bad thing because they were expensive. That's why it was a bad thing.
Okay.
Yeah, because whoever was selling them was charging more than you could get if you bought them from a health food shop. Anyway, since when do they need... even if that was the case, I thought they like all these entrepreneurs. For my own opinion, is that if people bought the stuff that they were selling that had my picture on the bottle, I'm very pleased that they were.
Right.
I endorsed that stuff. I said it's important that people should eat the calcium, to block the strontium and the uranium. So I never said that wasn't the case, but I did go out and say that people could buy the same thing from health food shops.
Yeah. So let me ask you this.
I never got any money out of it. It was nothing to do with money.
Is there a program to distribute potassium iodide in the tiny islands, no offense, of the UK? I mean, here's all these reactors.
Yes, there is. There sort of is, yeah. But I don't know whether they do it. I mean, they stocked up in the local areas to all the nuclear power stations.
Yeah, so you have to go towards the nuclear accident to get the pills.
Yes.
Yeah. What about emergency planning? I mean...
Oh, goodness knows. I mean, I think that there probably is something or another. But, I mean, the fact is when these things happen, they're always much worse than... I mean, recently I wrote about Sellafield. The Irish government the Irish Radiological Protection people were asked to write a paper about what would happen if Sellafield exploded, see. So they wrote this ridiculous report about what would happen if Sellafield exploded. And of course they reduced it down to sort of the smallest kind of explosion that you could imagine.
Sure.
And they drew in some plume that went over Ireland that looked to me like it had been drawn by somebody's daughter with a felt tip. Yeah. And it was just unbelievably pathetic. So Sean McGee asked me to check it out. So I did, and I went and did all sorts of quite hairy software work to work out what the real plume would be. And of course it covered the whole of Ireland, you see. So I wrote a report about that. The point is that they have their men. They have their individuals in positions of power and influence in all governments. That's what they have. And so if anybody actually asks a question, they always have somebody there to come along and say, oh, well, it's not a problem, and even if Sellafield did explode, 2 or 3 people would die, and it wouldn't be a big deal.
Other than the obvious reasons to have KI pills and a proper evacuation plan, pursuing them, I think, is a very important tool because it makes the subject unavoidable for the average person. When they're getting, in the mail a little package of pills, it's something you hold in your hand and see, oh, this is real. Whereas,
I agree. Well, there are lots of ways of going forward with this. There are lots of strategies, and there are lots of, and I endorse all of them. Every single person who's in any way anti-nuclear, and whatever strategy they have to try and stop the beast, I think hurrah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that my particular strategy has become refined now to attacking them on the health effects and increasingly to write this stuff into scientific journals. So in the last year or two, I've published 5 or 6 scientific papers in this area, and one of the recent ones was about power lines, because it turns out that the study that they've already done about power lines that cost £16 million in England shows quite clearly that it's the health effects, the childhood leukemia in children living near the power lines was caused by the concentration by the power lines of radioactive fallout from weapons testing. So that was a very interesting paper. I mean, I quite enjoyed writing that. So that's been published, and then more recently there have been other papers published, and I'm writing one now about radiation-induced dementia, which will be published soon.
Wow. You mentioned you posted something to YouTube recently, and so the question that comes to mind is, what's the channel we should be looking for on YouTube?
Well, they're various, but the main one is called Dr Woland.
Okay.
Dr Woland.
Okay. I think I've seen that one.
That's the one that most of it goes up on. I've got a sort of video outfit in Riga that does all this stuff. And that's called Dr. Woland. But there's another one that Dieter operates from Sweden, which is called Radioactive BSR.
Okay.
So some of them are on Radioactive BSR.
And is there a web page that is? There's Richard's.
Well, I've got my web page is called Green Audit.
Okay.
So it's www.greenaudit.org. And we did have another one called llrc.org, and the Dieter operates one called nuclearjustice.org, and she also operates one called bsrrw.org.
How would you describe the UK's view of nuclear? And let me just give you an example. I'm watching back episodes of Top Gear. I can't help it. And one of the episodes, they actually drove their cars toward and through Chernobyl. And, they did it in a kind of jolly, joking, non-serious kind of way. But on the other hand, and the way they filmed it was kind of gloomy. But even though that's all very superficial and entertainment, it plugs the issue into the brains of millions of viewers. So I got the sense that the fact that they even did that kind of means that it is sort of lurking in the background of people's minds. People are uneasy about nuclear.
Oh yes, yeah, they are. Yes, I mean, but it's very much projected as a thing about how tough you are.
Right.
Stoic.
So
like the tough guys don't worry about Chernobyl. They don't worry about radiation because they're tough.
I've never seen such stoicism from anyone except for people who present themselves as like nuclear power plant safety. I'm not sure what to call them, managers. But so the very people that are in charge of safety at a nuclear power plant are the ones who are the most dismissive. And there is this stoic attitude.
That's why they're idiots. They filter in for idiots. We had a guy. If ever anybody gets in there who isn't an idiot, they very rapidly leave. We had a guy up here in Travis who was quite a nice chap, a Welsh guy, and he quickly figured out that this stuff was dangerous, and he started telling everybody, and then he just had to leave, so he left. So the only people who are left behind are what you might call apparatchiks. They're people who just are technicians, so they just apply rules. That's what these health physicists are. They're not very bright.
What do you want Joe and Jane's six-pack to do? Do we go to, that's a weird way to put it, but, are we supposed to dress up in elephant outfits and show up at hearings and be the elephant in the room? Are we supposed to go to hearings?
If that's what you want to do, I agree. That's what you should do. I want Joe and Jane's six-pack to do whatever they think that they want to do.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to put down any sort of rules about how you should oppose this stuff.
Yeah.
There are lots of ways of opposing it. And if you want to dress up as an elephant, that's good enough. I dress up as an elephant from time. I used to do a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
We once chained Richard Bramhall to the stage as dressed as Death at the keynote speech that was being made by Sir Richard Dole. So we smuggled him in. We stole a load of delegate entry cards from a lot of Japanese people who didn't turn up because their plane didn't come. And so we went in there, and Richard was very, very well dressed up as Death from the Seventh Seal, so like with a skull and a long cloak and everything. We chained him to the stage just next to Sir Richard Dole, so he stood there the whole time kind of looking like Death, at the shoulder of Sir Richard Dole. I think that's great. And then we handed out copies of my book, Wings of Death, to all of the delegates. These were all scientific, posh delegates. I got into trouble about that because I got the money from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust to do that, and then I told them that I just wanted to go to the conference. I didn't tell them I was going to go there dressed as Death. So if you want to do that, that's good. That you should do that. Anything that draws attention to it is good, and if that's what you do, then hooray. It's not what I do anymore.
Well, it's so important. No, it isn't. It's important to have someone like yourself who's looking at the science of it, because there's so few people who are able to. But, that's outside of the scope of Joe and Jane Sixpack. And so telling the story of dressing up as Death is gold, because, it's those ideas that I'm fishing for. And so the hydro building here, the OPG, we used to be Ontario Hydro, it's a long story. Shining up a laser image of, an anti-nuclear emblem on the side of their building, or anything of these stunts just gets another person thinking about.
Yes. I'm all for people doing what they think, and then there are other people who write to papers about the economic situation, and there are people who talk about the moral aspects of it, and people There are all sorts of ways in which you can go for these people. I mean, I must say singing is a good one.
Huh.
So writing songs, writing anti-nuclear songs,
Right.
and putting them on YouTube, and all of that stuff is good.
Yeah, I think there was a band whose name escapes me after the Fukushima. They came out with a really hip-sounding, really infectious song, and they shot it, I think, with the background of these plants in Fukushima.
Well, I wrote a song about George W. Bush and depleted uranium in Iraq, which I sang on the stage in front of 5,500 people in Kuala Lumpur at this big conference that there was about what was it? It was making war criminalizing war. That was it. And I was there to talk about the effects of depleted uranium. And so I did give a talk about the effects of depleted uranium, and this was to a huge audience, including the Prime Minister of Malaysia and all sorts of top knobs. And I borrowed a guitar from one of the waitresses in the hotel, and I sang this song about George W. Bush and nose cones of uranium and leukemia and all that stuff. That's up on the internet somewhere.
After Fukushima, in the vacuum created, the information vacuum after every accident where we just simply can't hear any information from anywhere, I think I remember that you were pursued as being a source of information after. And what was your first thought when you heard that something had occurred in Fukushima?
Well, my first thought was that it had exploded. That was a nuclear explosion like Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was the first person to say that. I was on the BBC the same day that it happened. They called me in. As it happened, I was just coming back from France to Wales, and I was just passing through London at the time, and I was called by the BBC. I went into the studio at Wood Green, and there I was talking about it, and I said that this is a very serious accident. I mean, at that time, everybody was saying, it wasn't as bad as 3 Mile Island, and it was just a hydrogen explosion, and they'd soon get it under control, and blah, blah. And I said, no, it's not. It's a nuclear explosion, and it's contaminating the whole area. And then the next day, ITV got me, and then I was there on the television outside the House of Commons saying the same thing. And I was right. I mean, and then I was asked to go out to Fukushima. Shortly after that, I went out there and got on Japanese TV and had all sorts of people interview me. I went all over the place. I took a scintillation counter and I measured the radiation. I refused to go to the plant. I said, I'm not going anywhere near it. So I went to a place called, up in the mountains, Eizu Wakamatsu or somewhere, but that was contaminated as well. So and Tokyo was contaminated. So yeah, so I mean, all along I've said it was very dangerous, and then I worked out how many people were going to get cancer in the 200-kilometer radius. So I've done a lot of work on Fukushima, and then I wrote a book. Yeah, I wrote a book in Japanese. This Japanese reporter woman came and lived with me in Wales for 2 weeks, and together we wrote a book in Japanese called Fukushima the Horror. And that got published, and actually I got a bit of royalties off that. It sold quite well.
I remember a few things from it. I think after Reactor 3 blew up, I turned on CNN, and don't hold it against me, and there was Sanjay Gupta and Anderson Cooper standing in a field very close to Reactor 3. And they were all smiley, and I think they were talking about the American suggestion of an evacuation wider than what the Japanese were suggesting, and that was, you could see they were kind of smiley, and you got the sense they were kind of excited to be there. And then they go to commercial, and when they came back from commercial, the two of them looked gray-faced and terrified, and then I think they quickly broke to some other cut, and as far as I know, they were on the plane back to the States. So I always wondered, what did they hear in their earpieces between?
Well, we've seen all the exchanges. They were leaked, weren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, all the telephone conversation exchanges were leaked. I've certainly seen them all. There was a lot of fear. You know, they really did think that the whole thing was going to go up.
Mm. And then for us regular people, hearing just little bits and pieces in the weeks and months and up to a year after, I noticed the pattern that every 2 weeks they would say that the report they gave 2 weeks ago was twice as bad, they're finding out now. And this pattern just continued every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks it was always twice as bad now than they had reported it was really 2 weeks ago. And this doling out piecemeal information seemed to be an attempt to prevent some kind of panic rather than disclose.
Of course, yeah, of course.
But
I mean, well, it's the same as Chernobyl, really. You know, that was much the same.
But humans don't
stuff
panic.
Comes out in dribs and drabs.
We only panic in Godzilla movies. Humans, when faced with a disaster, we bind together. We help our neighbors. We look for the old people. We're not all trampling each other.
Oh, we don't live in that tribal society anymore. We live in an us and them society. I mean, in fact, in many ways, we live in a rational versus emotional society, except that the rational people are not rational at all. And the emotional people are much cleverer than the label emotional would suggest. It's a kind of Myers-Briggs thing where you have feeling on one side and you have thinking on the other side. It's a feeling-thinking split in society. And what happens is that the people who run society now, they do so on the basis of what you might call experts. So they have a whole lot of experts. And if they need to know something, they go to the experts. But the problem is the experts are not experts. The problem is that the experts are idiots, and the experts are people that they have employed to tell them what it is they want to know. You know, so the experts are not unbiased. So that's the rational side of it all. You know, if you like, that's the thinking side. Those are the people who run the show. But you have the people, and the people are on the feeling side, and they sort of think, hey, I don't like that. Well, that doesn't sound right to me. And, of course, the thinking people say, oh, of course, that's absolutely correct, because we're experts, and 2 pi r cos theta integral 1 to 2 is 4.9, you see. And then the people on the feeling side, they say, but I don't want a lot of radioactivity in my back garden. And the other people say, oh, yes, but of course it's perfectly safe because it's this and that. And, so this is the kind of split that there is in society now.
What have you got on the burner for the next year, do you think? Your projects?
Well, I'm going to write a lot of papers. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So, I've got a whole load of those. The thing is that what they can't do is stop you writing stuff in the scientific peer-reviewed literature.
Right.
And it's increasingly easy for me to get stuff out in the scientific peer-reviewed literature because the evidence is increasingly there that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And there are lots of journals now that will publish my stuff, whereas, 10 years ago it was much more difficult. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I'm doing a court case. We're back in the court in London on the nuclear test veterans. So I'm back there. I've managed to get get another load of veterans on, to take that case.
So it's a fresh new
British
case.
Government against the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah.
And also the other thing we're going to do is have a bit of fun, I don't want to spend my entire life sitting around doing all this radiation stuff. It's depressing.
Well, that's what I wanted to get at, too. Okay, so apparently you play a whole load of different instruments. I do, yes, yeah. And you're not interested in just uranium physics. You have other interests.
No, I'm interested in having fun. I'm interested in excitement and adventure, and I've got a few crappy old boats, and I've got a barge in France, and I've got an apartment in a little apartment in Riga, and various friends all over the place. So I want to sort of. I'm 72, man. I want to spend the rest of my time sitting there talking about radiation all day. In my opinion, I've already pulled the brick out at the bottom of their edifice, and given a bit of time, it's just going to collapse under its own weight.
Well, there's two things here. So one, I wanted to ask how does it feel being on the right side of an issue? Like,
I've always been
even
on
if
the
it's,
right side of the
I know,
issue.
even if it's difficult though, but there's something special about when you're telling the truth or you're just on the right side of an issue versus, somebody who's working as one of these, health inspectors at a nuclear power plant.
Yes.
There would be something soul destroying. Like deep down you would know you're on the wrong side. You're minimizing something that for the last 100 years,
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I mean, I don't know how they can live with themselves.
You live it. You feel proud. You do.
I do. Well, it's not that I don't really feel proud. I feel safe. I feel I can sleep at night, and I know that I'm doing the right thing, and I'm brave, and because bravery, it's a lot to do with bravery.
Yeah.
A lot of the reason these people do what they do is because they're cowards.
Okay.
And wait, right back at the beginning, you have to sort of make this decision. It's like Borges' story, The Garden of Forking Paths. If you go down the wrong path, then you can't go back again.
Right.
And then you've got another fork, and you then take the wrong path again. And before you know it, you're out in a place where you can't ever get back.
Right.
So you've got to be brave right from the beginning.
Well, it takes a lot of guts.
You have to be brave, and you have to sort of live with no money, and you have to sort of, you can't imagine the things that I've had to do in my life to just survive.
Yeah.
Goodness me.
Yeah. So there's that side, the positive side of being on the right side of an issue. But it comes with activism, a psychological effect. And I've mentioned this a few times in the podcast where for activists, there's a swing from sort of righteous indignation to it's hopeless, you can't fight City Hall. And it's this swing. And it comes, there's a cost to being an advocate because what you're doing is you're studying. It's bad news. I mean, all the stories that we tell when we're talking about nuclear, it's about contamination, leaks, deaths, spills, accidents, costs. It's pretty negative, and you have to have something that counteracts that, because you can get too deep into it and too depressed by the subject matter you're covering. And you use music and your other interests, it sounds like. Well,
I don't. Yes, I think you have to be born an optimist, in some way. I mean, this stuff that people have personalities. And they're born with those personalities. And, you have to be somebody who has at their core a kind of impossible to affect sort of little gem, that is the you. So no matter how far down you go and how far you get brought down, there's part of you there that thinks, well, that's it, I can't go any further and I'm okay here. And then you have to have this sort of moral decision that you make at some point to kind of pursue this particular course. And when you get worried and you think, oh God, I can't do this anymore, and so on, you have some little thing that keeps you going. I mean, in my case, there's a little girl from Sellafield that I had a picture of called Gemma Darcy, who died of leukemia. And whenever I think of giving up, I think of her. And so she keeps me going. She has a little bright smile, She's a little girl of 6 or something, And I think of her and I think, no. And also you get sort of bloody-minded about it too. But on the other hand, if it gets a bit tough and all that, I just go and play my violin like Sherlock Holmes, or my nickel harper or my accordion, or I go off in one of my boats, or I got lots of girlfriends and so on too, I've had various. I always have to have some kind of beautiful woman that I can think of or go to and cuddle up to or something. So
yeah, I like to think they're attracted to anti-nuclear people, but I'm not sure that's panning out.
I see. Yeah. Well, I think they probably are. In fact, the other thing about that, of course, is that all the beautiful women are anti-nuclear.
Mm-hmm. I've said that before. It's kind of politically incorrect, but
yes. Well, we have to be a bit careful about all of this shit now, because otherwise they'll lock us up. I mean, the world is getting really, very difficult.
Yeah.
The sort of things that I was in the fish and chip shop the other day, about a month ago, and there was this really gorgeous girl there with this sort of orange hair, young one, freckly face, blue eyes, and and I just looked at her, And she smiled at me, and so I said, I think you look really beautiful. And anyway, so she liked me saying that she was beautiful, but you've got to be so careful now. And then my wife, actually, she's not my wife. She was my wife, and I was just visiting her on my way to France. So I haven't been with her for about 20 years. But anyway, so she was there. She got in such a rage, and she said, she just wanted to say, "You get away, you old creep," and so on. So the trouble is now, and then she started saying I was Harvey Weinstein just because I told this woman she was beautiful. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be so careful. It's getting worse and worse, You can't do it anymore.
I get you.
Although I suppose being 72, I can do as I please, really.
Is there anything you want to add that we should promote?
Anybody who's interested in the origin of life, the spontaneous origin of life on Earth, which is kind of like the biggest question that's ever been asked.
Yeah.
I believe I figured it out. It's taken me 40 years, and so there's a paper about it. So if you put in Busby Maxwell's Demon Life, that scientific paper is there, and it tells you how life. Well, it tells you one explanation of how life might have begun on Earth spontaneously from chemicals.
From a swirling massive
because, Darwin's done all the rest of it. Darwin's done how, once you've got one cell, what happens. But nobody's figured out how you get from just ordinary amino acids and simple chemicals into something which is essentially living.
Yeah.
So that paper is there. I did a YouTube presentation on this thing about life in Aspen, Colorado. I was out there with the lawyers discussing these cases in America. So there's a video that I put up recently that was done by that guy who's a mate of Paul McCartney's. What's he called? Jerry Cope. So that's there.
Anyway,
but
thank you.
Listen, man, nobody's going to listen to 1.5 hours of me guessing on, are they?
You are nuts. People are going to be hanging off their seats.
Well, I hope you're right.
We reached Dr. Christopher Busby at Lindrendod Wells in Wales, UK by phone. Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes. If you enjoy the show, please rate us.
This has been TMI,